World War II. I know this isn't supposed to be a history book, but come on. After the United States entered World War II in 1942, Du Bois felt energized by Black America's Double V campaign. Victory against racism at home and victory against fascism abroad. The Double V campaign kicked the civil rights movement into high gear, and as World War II neared its end in April 1945, W.E.B. Du Bois joined representatives of 50 countries at the United Nations Conference on International Organization in San Francisco. He wanted the new United Nations Charter to become a buffer against racism. Then, later in the year, Du Bois attended the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England. Pan-Africanism is a movement that encourages solidarity among all people of African descent. Strength in numbers, global power. That was the key. At the 5th conference in 1945, Du Bois was fittingly introduced as the father of Pan-Africanism. In attendance were 200 men and women, including Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Kenya's Jomo Kenyatta, young revolutionaries who would go on to lead the African decolonization movements which were meant to remove colonial leaders. These delegates did not make the politically racist request of past Pan-African Congresses of gradual decolonization, as if Africans were not ready to rule Africans. And what I mean when I mention Africans ruling Africans is Africans governing themselves. Imagine that. It must have felt like a bomb dropped on the heads of racist Europeans. Those weren't the only bombs dropping. The United States emerged from World War II, looked over at the ravaged European and East Asian worlds and flexed its unmatched capital, industrial force, and military arms as the new global leader. The only problem was America, the land of the free, home of the brave, still had a race problem. And that race problem was starting to affect its relationships around the world. American freedom wasn't free. Hell, it wasn't even real. But no matter what compromises President Harry Truman, who took over after Roosevelt died in 1945, tried to make, the South always fought back. I almost don't want to tell you what happened because I've told you what happened a lot already. But if you were to guess that white people started to perpetuate lies about black people being inferior to keep the world of racism spinning, you'd be right. On February 2nd, 1948, Truman urged Congress to implement the Civil Rights Act despite the lack of support among white Americans. You can imagine the outrage. Many left the Democratic Party, others stayed and formed what they called the Dixiecrats, who, in order to fight back against Truman's push for civil rights, ran a man named Strom Thurmond for president. It was a grossly segregationist platform. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Black voters made sure Truman won. And once he did, his administration brought forth a few game-changing civil rights cases. 1. Shelley versus Kramer, 1948. The case was decided with the Supreme Court determining that the courts could not enforce whites-only real estate contracts in northern cities to keep out migrants and stop housing segregation. This brought on the open housing movement, which basically exposed white people, stopping black people from living where they wanted to live. The fear was the same old fear, that black people would make the neighborhoods dangerous, that their white daughters would be in danger, that the property value would go down. Some black people wanted to live in white neighborhoods for validation. Some black people were just looking for better housing options. Some white people were so afraid they literally packed up and left their homes. White flight. 2. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. I'm sure you've heard of this one. If you live in the South and go to a diverse school, this is why. This was the case that said racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The results, the schools began to mix. What's really interesting about this case, though, something rarely discussed, is that it's actually a pretty racist idea. I mean, what it basically suggests is that black kids need a fair shot, and a fair shot is in white schools. I mean, why weren't there any white kids integrating into black schools? The assumption was that black kids weren't as intelligent because they weren't around white kids, as if the mere presence of white kids would make black kids better. Not true. A good school is a good school, whether there are white people there or not. Oh, and of course, people were pissed about this. People were pissed about them both. And pissed people do pissed things. A year later, a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till was brutally murdered in Money, Mississippi for supposedly hissing at a white woman. They beat Till so ruthlessly that his face was unrecognizable during his open casket funeral in his native Chicago. The gruesome pictures were shown around the enraged black world at the request of his mother. And though supremacists in power continued to blame Brown v. Board of Education for the problems, young Emmett's death lit a fire under the civil rights movement led by a young, charismatic preacher from Atlanta who idolized W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr. There was a youthful energy to the movement, a new wave, a new way of doing things, and Du Bois loved watching it grow more and more powerful. He was now 90 years old and hopeful. He never stopped struggling, and Dr. King was cut from similar cloth. He and Du Bois had not let up, and neither had college students. 4 black freshmen at North Carolina A&T entered the Woolworths in Greensboro on February 1st, 1960. They sat down at the whites-only counter where they were denied service and stayed there until the store closed. Within days, hundreds of students from area colleges and high schools were sitting in. News reports of these nonviolent sit-ins flashed on TV screens nationally, setting off a sit-in wave to desegregate Southern businesses. By April, students were staging sit-ins in 78 Southern and border communities, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, had been established. These college kids were like new Negroes. They weren't waiting for white saviors, not in politicians like John F. Kennedy, who was running for office, or writers like Harper Lee, whose novel To Kill a Mockingbird was basically the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the civil rights movement. Don't mind if I don't. Nope, no white saviors for them. But they also weren't interested in being black saviors. They weren't necessarily saving themselves, they were just being themselves. But the thing about being black is that just being can bring bloodshed. And that's what Dr. King and the SNCC and the civil rights movement as a whole were banking on. The vicious violence in response to the nonviolent civil rights movement was embarrassing the country all around the non-white world. On April 3rd, 1963, King helped kick off a series of demonstrations in Birmingham, bringing on the wrath of the city's ruggedly segregationist police chief, Bull Connor. 9 days later, on Good Friday, 8 white anti-segregationist Alabama clergymen signed a public statement requesting that these unwise and untimely street demonstrations end. Martin Luther King Jr., jailed that same day, read the statement from his cell. Angry, he started doing something he rarely did. He responded to critics in his letter from Birmingham jail, published that summer. No one knows whether the sickly W.E.B. Du Bois read King's jailhouse letter. But just as Du Bois had done in 1903 and later regretted, in his letter, King erroneously conflated two opposing groups, the anti-racists who hated racial discrimination and the black separatists who hated white people in groups like the Nation of Islam. King later distanced himself from both, speaking to a growing split within the civil rights movement. More and more battle-worn young activists were becoming frustrated with King's nonviolence and were more often listening to Malcolm X's sermons. Malcolm X was a minister in the Nation of Islam, a religious organization focused on the liberation of black people through discipline, self-defense, community organizing, and a fortified understanding of who black people were regardless of white people's opinions. He preached that blacks were the original people of the world, which pushed back against the Bible and the early theories of white Egypt. He also preached black self-sufficiency, that black people could care for themselves, their families, and their communities all by themselves. Sure, he was a polarizing force, but he was also an anti-racist persuading away assimilationist ideas. On May 3rd, 1963, the young folks that followed leaders like Malcolm watched on television as Bull Connor's vicious bloodhounds ripped to pieces the children and teenagers of black Birmingham who'd been following Dr. King. As Connor's fire hoses broke limbs, blew clothes off, and slammed bodies into storefronts, and as his officers clubbed marchers with nightsticks, the world watched too. On June 11th, President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation, or the world rather, and summoned Congress to pass civil rights legislation. Today, we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free, Kennedy said. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. With the eyes of the globe on him, Kennedy, who really didn't have much of a choice, introduced civil rights legislation. But it didn't stop the momentum of the long-awaited March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Though it had been organized by civil rights group, the Kennedy administration controlled the event, ruling out civil disobedience. Kennedy aides approved the speakers and speeches, no black women, no James Baldwin, an openly gay black novelist who would become a bold and brilliant political voice through his writings, and no Malcolm X. On August 28th, approximately 250,000 activists and reporters from around the world marched to the area between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, and King closed the day with what's probably the most iconic speech of all time, I Have a Dream. But there was bad news. W.E.B. Du Bois had died in his sleep the previous day. Indeed, a younger Du Bois had called for such a gathering, hoping it would persuade millions of white people to love the lowly souls of black folk. And yes, the older Du Bois had chosen another path, the anti-racist path less traveled, toward forcing millions to accept the equal souls of black folk. It was the path of civil disobedience that the young marchers in the SNCC and CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, also responsible for much of the nonviolence training for the movement, had desired for the March on Washington, a path a young woman from Birmingham's Dynamite Hill was already traveling and would never leave. But Roy Wilkins, one of Dr. King's right-hand men and the bearer of the bad news, did not dwell on the different paths. Looking out at the lively March on Washington, he just asked for a moment of silence to honor the 95-year-old movement of a man. Section 5, 1963 to today. Chapter 21, When Death Comes. Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Carol Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins. These were the names of 4 girls killed in a church bombing. It's September 16th, 1963. The Herald Tribune. Angela Davis was a college student, a junior at Brandeis University when she read these names in the newspaper. 4 girls killed in Birmingham, Alabama. Angela Davis was from Birmingham. She knew these names. Her mother, Sally, had taught Carol Denise in the 1st grade. The Robertson and Davis families had been close friends for as long as she could remember. The Wesleys lived around the block in the hilly Birmingham neighborhood where Angela grew up. Angela's mother wasn't deterred by the bombings. It was a frightening and painful moment, but the Davises were active, and by active, I mean activists. Sally Davis had been a leader in the Southern Negro Youth Congress, an anti-racist organization that protested racial and economic disparities. On Dynamite Hill, where Angela Davis grew up, Sally and her husband trained their daughter to be an anti-racist, and so most of her childhood was spent wrestling with the poverty and racism around her. Why didn't her classmates have certain things? Why were they hungry? Why weren't they able to eat in school? She even decided early on that she would never, despite the pressure, desire to be white. She fought and spoke out all the way up until she got to college at Brandeis, a predominantly white institution where she didn't agree with the kind of activism going on, an activism laid out by white people who couldn't see that they weren't the standard. But she found her outlets. She found a place to put her activist energy. James Baldwin, one of Davis's favorite authors, came to Brandeis in 1962, just before the release of his activist manifesto, The Fire Next Time. Baldwin crafted a collection of essays that encapsulated the black experience with racism. The book contains a letter to his nephew, warning him of the oppression coming his way, and another letter addressing the centennial celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation, in which he charges both black and white Americans to attack the nasty legacy of racism. It's a macro and micro examination of the American race machine, and ultimately, a masterclass in anti-racism. Malcolm X also came, and though Davis didn't agree with his religious leanings, she really fell in line with his political ideas. She was fascinated by the way he explained the racism black people had internalized, an inferiority complex forced on them by white supremacy. But during Davis's junior year, while studying abroad in France, she was emotionally transported home when she read the four names in the Tribune: Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Carol Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins. Back to Dynamite Hill. Davis didn't see this moment as a special event, a one-off incident, no. She had grown up fully aware of American racism and its deadly potential. All she could do was swallow it and use it as fuel to keep fighting. President John F. Kennedy, on the other hand, had to figure out how to fix it. Well, there was no fixing it, but at least he had to do something to snuff out what could become a complete explosion on Dynamite Hill. He launched an investigation, which, by the way, caused his approval ratings to drop. Can you believe that? 4 children were killed, bombed. And because the president tried to get to the bottom of it, his Southern constituents and supporters were actually upset. Kennedy tried to rebound, tried to boost his ratings back up in Dallas 2 months later. He never made it back to the White House. 2 days after Kennedy's burial, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was now president, proclaimed that the civil rights bill that Kennedy had been working on would be passed. But what did that mean? On paper, it would mean that discrimination on the basis of race was illegal. But what it actually meant was that white people, even those in favor of it in theory, could then argue that everything was now fine, that black people should stop crying and fighting and get over everything because now things were equal. It meant they'd argue what they'd been arguing, that black people's circumstances are caused solely by themselves, and if they just worked harder and got educations, they'd succeed. It meant they'd completely ignore the hundreds of years of head starts white people had in America. And the worst part, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would have caused white people to rethink white seniority and superiority, and instead of dealing with it, they turn it on its head, flip it around, do the old okey doke, and claim that they were now the victims, that they were being treated unfairly, unjustly. So even though the act was supposed to outlaw discrimination, it ended up causing a backlash of more racist ideas. Nonetheless, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the first important civil rights legislation since the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Hours after President Johnson signed it into law on July 2nd, 1964, he hit the TV screen to play up the whole American ideal of freedom. His appearance on television may as well have been a sitcom, a show fully cast with the best actors, complete with smiling faces and a laugh track, and black Americans, at least those who'd seen the show before, looked on, entertained, but fully aware it was all scripted. And cut. Malcolm X, full of distrust for America, spoke out not against the bill, but about the likelihood of it actually ever being enforced. Who was going to make sure the laws would be followed if the lawmakers, and law enforcers were all white and racist? Angela Davis felt the same way, and Angela and Malcolm weren't wrong. This was a political play. President Johnson knew that since he'd made it about Kennedy, this bill wouldn't hurt his position as president or his potential to get reelected. At least that's what he thought. But George Wallace, the governor of Alabama and ultimate racist, threw a major wrench into Johnson's reelection plans. Wallace had taken a public stand for segregation the year before and received 100,000 letters of support, mostly from Northerners. Wait, what? Yeah. Northerners, sending in letters in support of Wallace's stance for segregation. This proved painfully that everyone, the North and the South, hated black people. Barry Goldwater, a senator from Arizona, was also running. Goldwater was ushering in a new kind of conservatism. His platform was that government assistance, which white people had been receiving for a long time, was bad for human beings, that it turned people into animals. Of course, this racist epiphany hit Goldwater once black people started receiving government assistance too. Funny how that happens, yet not funny at all. It's like someone telling you they hate your shoes, and then a week later, once they put you down and made you feel insecure, they start wearing them. This strange game of whatever's good for the goose not being good for the gander. A gander is a male goose, but for this example, a gander is a whole bunch of black people. But Goldwater, despite the support he had from well-to-do whites, didn't worry Johnson either. Johnson was concerned about the black political movements like the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who weren't satisfied with what Johnson was doing for them. The Northern activists had been dealing with and protesting police brutality and exploitation. The Southern activists had survived and were continuing to survive the Klan. And what did Johnson offer them? What leverage did he grant the SNCC and MFDP? 2 seats at the Democratic National Convention, which was basically nothing. No power. And without power, all the protesting in the world meant nothing. The shift went from fighting for civil rights to fighting for freedom. The difference between the two is simple. One implies a fight for fairness. The other, a right to live. Malcolm X's empowerment philosophy of black national and international unity, self-determination, self-defense, and cultural pride started to sound like music to the ears of the SNCC youth. At the end of 1964, Malcolm X returned from an extended trip to Africa to a growing band of SNCC admirers and a growing band of enemies. Unfortunately, a few months later, February 21st, 1965, at a Harlem rally, Malcolm would be gunned down by those enemies. When James Baldwin heard the news in London, he was devastated. When Dr. Martin Luther King heard the news in Selma, Alabama, he was calm, reflective. Acknowledged that though they didn't always agree on methods, much like Du Bois in Washington and Du Bois in Garvey, they wanted the same thing. Malcolm X's death rocked the black anti-racist followers, especially the ones populating urban environments. He'd instilled a sense of pride, a sense of intellectual prowess, a sense of self into many. He made street guys feel like they had a place in the movement. He gave athletes like Muhammad Ali a higher purpose than boxing. He debated and deconstructed racism with a fearlessness many people had never seen, and his ideas evolved into a more inclusive constitution just before the end of his life. The media, however, well, the media did what the media had been doing for decades, centuries. They spun his entire life into a boogeyman tale, devoid of context. Malcolm X's life was strangely and pitifully wasted, read a New York Times editorial. But anti-racists honored him and would have something to hold on to forever to reference his ideas. Alex Haley had been working with Malcolm on his autobiography, and the book would be published after his death. His ideological transformation from assimilationist to anti-white separatist to anti-racist inspired millions. He argued that though white people weren't born racist, America was built to make them that way, and that if they wanted to fight against it, they had to address it with the other racist white people around them. He critiqued black assimilationists, called them puppets, especially the leaders who had exploited their own people to climb the white ladder. Malcolm X stamped that he was for truth, not hate. Truth and truth alone, no matter where it was coming from. His autobiography would become anti-racist scripture. It would become one of the most important books in American history. President Johnson, still dealing with the hate from white people and the distrust from black people around the Civil Rights Act, decides to go even further than that bill, decides to double down, dig his heels into the anti-racist mud. After the Civil Rights Act came the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And though it would cause what every bit of progress caused, white rage and resistance, the Voting Rights Act would become the most effective piece of anti-racist legislation ever passed by the Congress of the United States of America.